It's wonderful to be here again. My name is Blair Scogie. This is my second year here, and it's my pleasure to speak with you today about multiplexes and how we plan for multiplexes. As part of this journey, I'm going to provide you a bit of a background on what multiplexes are in the context of the City of Toronto, how they're defined, the process that led to regulations that now permit multiplexes, and things that have sort of transpired since then. So we're going to talk about a little bit about the monitoring and review process that's underway. We're going to talk about a pilot project that occurred in Ward 23, and we're going to talk about work that's ongoing to expand permissions to 6 plexes on a citywide basis. So a little bit about me. So I'm a managing principal at my own company. It's called Scogie Planning. I also teach at TMU and the University of Waterloo, primarily studio-based courses and urban design lecture-based courses. I'm a registered professional planner and urban designer. I have degrees in architecture and planning. My focus has been almost entirely in consulting and in academia for the last sort of 16, 17 years. And the main sort of focus of my work is sort of operating at the intersection of housing, the environment, and design. Anecdotally, I kind of like soft launched my own company here last year. I met a lot of really interesting people, and I've gone on to sort of specialize in precisely the types of things that we're talking about today. I do a lot of multiplexes, I do a lot of major streets work. So I'm very excited to be here. If you'd like to reach out to me, I don't have business cards, but this is my information. It will also be on the last slide. So what is a multiplex? Well, multiplex, if you look at the zoning bylaw in the City of Toronto, if you're a nerd like me and you like to do that kind of stuff, you'll see that multiplex is actually not a defined term. But what is defined is duplex, triplex, and fourplex. So in the context of the City of Toronto, that's how we define a multiplex. It's a residential building that includes either 2, 3, or 4 entirely self-contained units that are located either partially or entirely above one another. They may also be sort of, adjacent to one another, horizontally speaking. They're independent apartments. They're self-contained. They include all the functions of an independent dwelling unit, so washrooms, kitchen, etc. They can vary in size and design and configuration. They have their own utility connections. They can have consolidated entrances, with a shared lobby space, but they can also have individual entrances at the exterior of the building. They can be achieved through conversion of an existing building, so taking a large single detached dwelling and converting it into a multiplex through interior renovations, retrofits, vertical, horizontal additions, some combination of things, but they can also be comprised of new construction, and they often are. They are a longtime staple of the built fabric of the City of Toronto. We have examples from, there's the quintessential Toronto triplex that's sort of vertically stacked that you see throughout portions of the city that has, been around for, half a century. And we have older examples of that predate zoning. But when we introduced zoning, we started to regulate these things out of existence. And only recently did we actually say, hey, we like these things. We should actually create rules to allow these things to exist. And we actually, created the opportunity to permit them. So multiplexes have many benefits. You've probably heard about the amount of growth that we've had in the City of Toronto over the last sort of 20, 30 years, and Chris was kind of touching upon this. What you may not know is that a lot of that growth it's not really distributed growth. I mean, historically speaking, it's been fairly concentrated in the downtown, the centers, the avenues. Neighborhoods have been kind of off limits up until fairly recently. They've been protected, okay? The physical character, this is the most annoying term, okay? But the physical character of neighborhoods has been protected, and they're envisioned as being stable, not static, but stable. So in other words, they're not intended for massive intensification. But we have for many years been kind of missing the mark on, the population in these neighborhoods has actually been decreasing significantly. Many of these, not like some American cities, but our neighborhoods have kind of hollowed out to an extent. And so part of the benefit of multiplexes is actually helping to reestablish these historic populations and make better use of existing services, amenities, and infrastructure that we've already built. We've already paid for, we've already got. And all the benefits that come with that. So, benefiting local businesses, greater transit ridership, taking people out of cars, like that kind of stuff, right? They also offer a range of housing types and unit sizes in locations that are sought after in the city. Not everybody needs a large single-family dwelling or wants one, but they might want to have ground-related housing in a neighborhood. This presents that opportunity. They can also be constructed relatively quickly, sustainably, and inexpensively. Again, to Chris's point, wood frame construction can be built over a matter of months, right, instead of years. So how did we get here? So a few years ago, the City of Toronto led, at the direction of Council, a study on multiplexes as part of a broader umbrella initiative called the Expanding Housing Options in Neighborhoods Initiative. That's a mouthful, so we call it the EHON Initiative. It's comprised of several different studies. The multiplex study was one of them. You're also, from NAMA, you're going to hear about the Major Street study. That's another. Okay, so the multiplex study was undertaken by staff. It assessed the feasibility permitting duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes on a citywide basis in all lands that are designated neighborhoods in the official plan and zone residential. Okay? It was approved by Council in May of 2023, so to Chris's point, around the time that the first Missing Middle Summit was held. And it resulted in the creation of citywide official plan and zoning bylaw amendments, which were the implementation tools to allow this to happen. So, diving into them, I'm not going to get into a ton of detail, but at the official plan level, we introduced OPA 649. So this amends the City of Toronto official plan to establish permissions and development criteria for multiplexes in all lands designated neighborhoods throughout the City of Toronto. I'm not going to read them, but these are a list of these sort of performance sort of standards that were introduced to the official plan level. So it expects, it respects the existing lot patterns, block structure, preserving trees, landscaping, et cetera, et cetera. It also importantly amended, a section of the official plan on neighborhoods that said that, development that's in neighborhoods needs to be, reflective of the existing physical context. Well, exceptions were made to that policy to allow for multiplexes because in many neighborhoods, multiplexes don't exist, and so they don't constitute the physical character of a neighborhood. But they're things we want to incentivize and encourage, and so we actually changed the language in the official plan to facilitate it. So it was implemented through a site and area-specific policy, and it applies to all neighborhoods. And at the zoning level, so ZBA 474/2023, and if you're a planning nerd like me, you memorize these things, but or you try to impress audiences with your ability to remember these numbers. It amends the zoning bylaw, again, to permit these uses, specifically duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes, on an as-of-right basis throughout the City of Toronto. So it assumes, in the process of doing so, it assumes, to Brad's point, that we're a very conservative city. It assumes the performance standards, generally speaking, of what is currently permitted for detached and semi-detached dwellings in the City of Toronto. So there were not any major big moves in terms of reducing setbacks, et cetera. So a lot of the rules are harmonized, but there are a few exceptions which are made specifically with the intent of responding to the typology and the unique needs of that typology and incentivizing it. So, for example, responding to the needs of the typology. So permissions around the number of porches and decks that you can have, allowing for slightly deeper buildings up to 19 meters where the standard is otherwise 17 meters in sites that qualify as, quote, deep lots. There are certain zones in the city where the maximum permitted building height is less than 10 meters. Well, you can't build a 3-story multiplex with, a maximum height permission of 8 or 9 meters. So, increasing that slightly. Exempting from number of stories. So there are actually certain areas of the city where on top of building height, they actually regulate the number of stories that you can have. And so there's an exemption from that, as there is density. So in Toronto, we calculate physical density through floor space index. And you're permitted up to write 4 units within a building. Other considerations that you may not be, but you may be aware of. So now that these permissions are in place, that's the baseline. And so if you go to the Committee of Adjustment, that is the baseline. So if you're looking for a reduction in the setbacks or a slight increase in height, or you want to go for a 5th or 6th unit, the baseline is 4. These are the permissions. It makes it easier to push the envelope a little bit further now that these are the baseline as-of-right permissions. And quite often we need some kind of a technical variance just to achieve what the city says they want, but it also serves as a baseline to push things maybe slightly further too. You're also exempt from development charges and cash in lieu for parkland dedication, provided there are no more than 4 units on a lot. And that's important because, as I'm trying to think of it, I think it was Brad who mentioned, a lot of the time to make these projects pencil, we're actually looking at 4 units plus a garden suite or a laneway suite. So we're actually talking about 5 units. And the way that you go about doing that can trigger or not trigger development charges, depending on whether or not you deliberately circumvent the DC bylaw. So you may pay DCs on all 5 units if you do things by the book, but you can also avoid them entirely. So I'm not going to get into Bill 23 in a lot of detail because I'm hoping some of you have a baseline knowledge in that. There's been a lot of bills, about a lot of pieces of legislation ran through by the provincial government in the last couple of years. It's hard to keep track of all of them, but Bill 23 was essentially, introduced to help at a high level, help the province meet its target of building 1.5 million new homes in Ontario in the next sort of decade. And as part of an implementation tool to that, the province of Ontario introduced Regulation 462-24 with the express intent of permitting up to 3 units per lot as of right across the province. Okay, so this is an example of the province trying to lead by example and override municipal regulations that are in many jurisdictions actually holding back general density, right? So in Toronto, we had these permissions already by the time this came out, but most municipalities don't have these or didn't have these things, right? And so, when this came into force, by law in every jurisdiction across Ontario, you can now have 3 units on every residential lot in an urban condition. They could be either offered through some combination of, up to 3 in the main dwelling, or 2 in the main dwelling and 1 in an accessory structure, okay? And then it incorporates, in addition that they reduced minimum separation distance requirements between the primary building and the accessory building down to 4. In the city of Toronto, it was, up to like 7.5 meters, depending on the height and all that kind of stuff of your laneway suite. Maximum lot coverage, they set at 45%, and they exempt these developments, multiplexes, from FSI across the province. So, in Toronto, we already generally kind of meet or in many cases exceed these regulations. So it hasn't really impacted us. The one thing I'd say is that lot coverage is something that's regulated through the zoning bylaw, through the use of tools we call zoning overlays, and they're regulated on a site and area specific basis. So there are and then there's all these exceptions, Chapter 900 exceptions to the zoning bylaw, that in place, in addition to that, another layer of regulation that says, actually in this area, these specific policies apply, and some of them relate to lot coverage. So this sort of increases the minimum threshold in the City of Toronto with respect to lot coverage for this typology. But more broadly, this regulation signals to municipalities across Ontario the province's intent to encourage and incentivize and promote and expedite gentle density in neighborhoods. So I'm not going to talk about the monitoring program in detail. My friend is going to come up here, and Daniel is going to talk to it in a minute in much greater detail. But after the planning study was finished and council approved the multiplex bylaw in May of 2023, the city started undertaking a 2-year monitoring and review program to track permit activity and building outcomes, identify barriers and issues, with the intent of supporting evidence-based refinements to the zoning bylaw. And I'm not going to get into that in detail because Daniel's going to talk on it, but so they're looking at the volume of applications, committee of adjustment decisions, et cetera, and they're going to be going to council with recommendations on their findings in the first quarter of next year. I had the good fortune of helping spearhead the Ward 23 pilot project with the ward councillor, Jamal Myers, and his staff. So this was undertaken with the intent of looking at the potential of 6 plexes and 5 plexes, and to demonstrate to the city that the sky doesn't fall if you permit them, so to sort of set the stage for a citywide 6-plex study, which I'm going to talk about next because we're actually doing it. Ward 23 was chosen for a number of reasons. I mean, it had a councillor that wanted to do it, which is, Brad, to his credit, he piloted a program in his ward looking at the missing middle a few years ago, under similar circumstances. But it's also, it's more of a suburban jurisdiction. They have larger lots, and they want to test the potential of 5 plexes and 6 plexes on these sort of more suburban conditions. So they assumed performance standards consistent with the multiplex study with a couple of exceptions. The main thing being that they limited it to detached buildings. So you cannot in Ward 23 build a semi-detached 6-plex. It's got to be a detached building. It was approved by council in January of this year and implemented through ward-wide OPA and ZBAs. So now briefly going to just sort of talk about the citywide 6-plex study, which we're in the process of undertaking at the city. So it builds upon the findings of the Ward 23 pilot program and the interim findings of the multiplex monitoring program, which again, Daniel's going to talk about. It assesses the feasibility of permitting 5 plexes and 6 plexes within all residential zones across the city. It assumes the performance standards of the Ward 23 pilot program, so limiting it to the detached buildings. And they're considering, and I say considering because they're still consulting on this, still determining what they're going to recommend to council, but they're considering some other performance standards beyond that. So requiring a minimum 1.2 meter setback on one side to allow for, I presume, and city can speak to this in greater detail, landscaping, tree plantings. No parking requirements, meaning visitor and accessible is my understanding, which are currently still required for developments of this kind of scale. Maximum 50% of the facade can be dedicated to a garage if and when one is provided, and looking for at least one large family-sized unit in the buildings. At least this is what they're consulting on. So they're also considering opportunities where they might want to increase permitted building heights up to 4 stories to respond to allow for functional unit layouts and livable spaces in areas where they're irregular lots, they're small lots, that kind of stuff, where they're challenging sites to deal with. So the city staff are going to report on their findings and recommendations in June 2025. So like next month, they're going and presenting to Planning and Housing Committee and then Council, recommending adoption of the number of units, permit the number of units citywide. So allow for 6 plexes citywide, and with the intent of going back to Council at the end of the year to recommend additional performance standards to modify the building envelope, if that makes sense. So pending approval, be implemented through citywide OPA and ZBA. Finally, here's just and I'm at time, so I'm not going to go through this in detail, but these are some high-level recommendations that I think the city should consider in the process of undertaking their citywide 6-plex study and formulating recommendations to council. So fast-tracking the application review and evaluation process, aligning soft costs, so application fees, with the scale of the development. I would suggest even eliminating unit caps and actually embracing form-based codes and letting the form dictate and the building code dictate the number of units. Increasing the DC exemption to 6 units at a minimum to at least align it with as-of-right permissions that they're exploring, and change the way that they apply DCs on an incremental basis beyond that, because currently, if you have 5 units and you're exempt from 4, you pay all 5, right? Unless you circumvent it. Establishing OPC alternative compliance standards for certain building typologies, Part 3 and Part 9 buildings. Like, do you really need an elevator for a 4-story multiplex? Do you really need, 2 means of egress? Do you really need certain types of fire separation? Maybe Conrad can speak to this. Conrad's sort of a building code expert. He can speak to this when he gets up here, I don't know. And build capacity among designers, builders, and inspectors. So that's my presentation. Thanks very much for your time. Appreciate it.